Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Michael Sandler, your host on Inspire Nation. If you've ever wanted greater success in your life, then do we have the Passion Paradox show for you. Today I'll be talking with Brad Stulberg and Steve Magness, co-authors of the bestseller Peak Performance and authors of a brilliant book on finding success, The Passion Paradox. And that's just what I want to talk with them about today, about going all in, finding success, and discovering the benefits of an unbalanced life. That plus we'll talk about Bon Jovi, Warren Buffett, Canterbury Tales, Tius Andronicus, James Cameron and scuba diving, Katie Ledecky and $5 million, Plato and the Golden Mean, Coach Gerald Stewart, the importance and relief of Sam Worley, what on earth is a barbell strategy, and what in the world do two kitty cats who think they're the stars have to do with anything. Gotcha. So welcome to the show, Brad and Steve. Are you both ready to shine?
Ready as we're going to be. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
All right. So I know you said to try to direct the question to one or the other, but this beginning question, I just have to put out there. Why'd you both decide to write a second book on passion before your first book was even out?
It's a great segue into the book and also into us as individuals a little bit. So the short version of the longer story is this. Steve lives in Houston, I live in Oakland, and the two of us were expecting edits on our first book. We had turned in the manuscript, and those edits were running behind. The publisher was just backed up. So Steve was out in Oakland for a 10-day stretch, and we got a note from our publisher saying, the book looks great. I'm only going to have minor line edits, but I don't have them ready yet. We were first-time authors with a big publishing house. Instead of being super stoked and going to the bourbon, smoking a joint, and going on vacation, we sat there for about 30 minutes, and we thought to ourselves, what are we going to do next? Yeah. And then about 30 minutes later, we thought to ourselves, what's wrong with us? Like, why can't we just be content for a little bit? Growing up in different capacities, both of us were always known as super driven pushers, really passionate people. Mm-hmm. And that was always lauded and applauded, championed by coaches, by parents, by teachers. And here we are 1 hour after getting news that our first book was going to go, and we really struggled to just sit with it. So as introspective people, we started trying to reflect on, well, what does this mean? And is this passion? And if this is passion, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Is it both? And for about the next 10 days nonstop, we dove into the research on passion, and it was our best attempt to have our cake and eat it too. So we wrote the book that we were trying to figure out for ourselves. And as we went into the reporting and the research, it just so happens that a lot of other people are trying to figure this out too.
So, and Steve, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think that sums it up pretty well. It's kind of ironic. It's like, our agent was so against this, and we were so worried about telling him. We're like, oh gosh, he's going to kill us for this, because here we are, first-time authors, like, and he's going to be like, what are you guys doing? And he was eventually like, you write books every 3, 4, 5 years. You don't write books like every
few weeks. Yeah.
Yeah. So we got a little bit of a verbal lambasting, which was rightfully deserved. But I think over time we saw like this was a topic that was near and dear to our heart, and we didn't dive into it because we were like, oh, let's go, get some notoriety and put another book out there. It was because we saw this issue in ourselves, and we were like, okay, well, I'm sure other people deal with it. How do they deal with it? And is this good or bad? What do we do with this?
So it's interesting. There's several pieces going on. First off, you had built up a head of steam, which means you had sort of either systematized a process or temporarily rewired yourselves as writers. So it makes sense that you would grab that next thing and hold on to it. Now, there's a dark side to passion here. Even before I get to your backgrounds, when my wife and I got a 2-book deal years ago, we went before even finishing what we were doing in the first book, we dove so head into heels into the second book because we were afraid of getting off of the gas. And we had completely lost balance, lost self-awareness. In this case, it sounds like you actually were aware. We're going to get in trouble. Are we going off the deep end here? But so many of your clients, of your athletes, of yourselves you had found yourself going down that slippery slope of what's passion versus what is over the edge. You felt you had to do it.
Exactly.
So let's go into background here real briefly, and then let's dive into this beautiful book. So Steve, first, what's your background and what can you tell us about yourself growing up in passion?
Yeah, so my background is as an athlete and a runner. So I grew up as a very successful high school runner. I ran 4 minutes and 1 second for a mile as an 18-year-old and was the fastest high school miler in the country. And then, so my whole world revolved around running. School, girlfriends, whatever, anything else, that didn't exist. Like, my life was entirely running. So my view on passion and almost having this obsession developed out of that, is that I was used to knowing what it meant to go all in, because, like, that's what I did and that's what I thought was required at the time for success. So fast forward a couple of years is going through that. My identity was tied around running. I never got faster or better despite working harder. So it really set the stage for understanding, okay, passion is this like jet fuel that can push us to do incredible amounts of work, just as you said with your wife and yourself on their book. Like, it can fuel insane things. But, where is that directed?
Thank you. And so going from there, Brad, what's your background and what was passion in your life growing up?
So it's pretty parallel to Steve's, except I wasn't nearly as good of an athlete as Steve. I was a decent athlete, but I tended to direct it more towards intellectual and entrepreneurial pursuits. Yeah. So I went straight out of school to work for McKinsey & Company, which is a large international consulting firm. I went straight from there for a job at the National Economic Council in the White House. I went straight from there to a scholarship to University of Michigan for graduate school. And it was just go. And it's interesting because it can sound like I might have been ambitious and motivated by achievement, and that was definitely some of it. But for me, it was just more of a curiosity and intellectual stimulation to chase the next problem to solve, and to constantly be in doing mode. Mm-hmm. And at the time, I didn't even know what being mode was, or that such a mode was accessible. And that's still a challenge for me. And that's part of, again, the manifestation of this book is, for individuals that are wired in doing mode, there's kind of two ends of the barbell. One end of the barbell is to try to cultivate some being and rewire that a bit. And the other end of the barbell is when you're in doing mode, to be aware of it and then to point that in positive directions. In more of a mindfulness sense, it's, I guess, the difference between skillful and unskillful action. So if you're going to be acting, how can you make sure it's skillful?
It's interesting because I've been working on getting, particularly this year, we've had 2 miscarriages, and so we've done a lot of circling the wagons in our house and going back into the being mode. But what's fascinating, and I go back to Dr. Srini Pillay of Harvard, who has a book, beautiful book, Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try. And actually, and Dr. Amit Goswami as well, they talk about the same concept. Amit calls it doobie-doobie-doo. We're constantly bouncing back and forth between doing and being. I found for myself that when I go to being mode, all these great ideas come to me for even more of the doingness.
Totally.
And there's a lot of fascinating science behind that too, right? Is when we were researching our first book, Peak Performance, like, we found that a lot of the breakthroughs happen when people shift from that doing to being, right? It's when you spend a lot of time digging deep into a topic, and then you step away, and maybe it's, to go sit outside in nature or go for a walk, or for me, go for a jog. And all these ideas percolate in your mind, and like the answers start popping up, and you're like, oh, I got to shift back into doing mode. So it's this interesting cycle.
I think the only other thing to layer on is, because, Mike, I know that you and your audience has some interest in mindfulness and meditation, is I would really situate this book in the context of when you're sitting on the mat or the cushion and you're in being mode, and then suddenly all these insights or ideas to pursue come up. There's many ways to go about it, but I look at that on 2 kind of different ends of the spectrum. One way is to be able just to release from those and let those thoughts go and come back to where you are and release from them and release from them. Another way is to acknowledge them as an insight and then take some kind of action. And this book focuses on the latter. So you're being bombarded with ideas or stimulus for the next thing. Okay, let's accept that that's how you're wired. Don't judge yourself, because that doesn't do any good. But just pursuing them blindly without some coaching and without kind of some guide rails or a path can lead to all kinds of issues. So we try to set out a path to be able to pursue that mode fruitfully.
Beautiful. And I want to dive into that path. I'm thinking my wife and myself, we're going out for a beautiful healing adventure. We're going to go for, I'm calling it wogging, a walk/run out in Moab around Arches on Saturday. And it's a long drive to get there, a long drive to get back. And we'll probably be doing very little of actual walking and jogging in the middle because it's been snow country here all winter, which we enjoy. So we've gotten soft, so to speak, for the hard stuff. But we're taking a notebook with us so that any ideas that pop up, we can get them down, and then we can actually mind map them out and become aware of what's coming to us. Chapter 1, when you start this book, you've got a beautiful quote from Bon Jovi. And you talk about passion must be handled with care. I'm actually going to go to Steve first, because poor Steve, you got introduced as the 401 guy until you're just like, no mas. What can you tell us about passion having to be handled with care?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I think passion is like this jet fuel, right? And if you just set it off and let it go, it can take you in any direction, and before you know it, you turn around and you're like, where am I and why did I end up here? And that's that's part one of this passion has to be handled with care, in the sense that if you're not attuned to that, if you're not being intentful on what direction you're heading, like, you can end up anywhere, just like I did in my running career, ending up in the sense of like, why am I still obsessing over this running thing? There might be better options. So that's part one, and I'll let Brad outline maybe the second part of handling it with care.
Perfect.
Yeah, that second part is, so you're going down the road of passion and the passionate pursuit, and maybe you're in what you want to be in for all the right reasons, and then you start to achieve some kind of success. And what can happen, often very subtly without even noticing it, is you go from being passionate about the activity to being passionate about the external validation, the recognition, and the rewards that the activity brings. And it's a very, very slippery slope. And when you're passionate about the activity, that's called harmonious passion. That's awesome. That's the stuff that gives your life meaning. When you're passionate about the external validation that activity might bring, that's called obsessive passion. The Buddha called that suffering. That is when you're craving for the next bit of recognition, the next bit of notoriety, the next reward. And what often happens, again, is people start out in this harmonious place. They start to do well. Humans evolve to really need and thrive off of social gratification. So then you become more passionate about that than the thing itself. And again, what's a fascinating kind of pearl that runs throughout this book is, so modern science calls this hedonic adaptation, or the idea that you get to a state of happiness and then it's not long before you need the next thing. And there's all kinds of modern cognitive behavioral therapy, acceptance and commitment to work on this cycle of suffering. And 2,500 years ago, before any science was out there, the Buddha literally identified this as being stuck in the cycle of craving and suffering. So it's really about, how do you keep passion geared for the thing itself, not for all the external stuff. They're not totally binary. So unless you spend a lot of time on retreat and you have cultivated a Zen-like mind, you are going to feel good when your book sells, when you finish a marathon, when you get investment for your entrepreneurial venture. That stuff feels good. Sometimes that might be 80% of what's driving you. But over the long haul, it's so important that that's kept a minority. And when I first started, I'm like, even if it's just 51% harmonious, 49% obsessive and external, you'd be fine. Now in myself, seeing how these ebb and flow and really rubbing my nose in it, paying attention, I tend to be happiest and operate best when it's about 60% drive from within and 40% still getting excited about retweets and having people like you reach out to talk to me.
And I think it's incredibly important to point out that or to reiterate that, because what happens sometimes is when you point out this, like, oh, there's these two kinds of passion, like a good kind and a bad kind. Sometimes people sit there and think like, oh, well, I want to sell books and I want to win this race and like I'm feeling good about this, like, but this is a bad thing. So you start judging yourself, right? When we're in the middle of book launch time, it's like, yes, like it's okay to feel good about getting sales and all that stuff because it's important and we're humans, right? But we don't want to get in a state where we step back and be like, none of this is allowed. What's really important is that you don't judge yourself, A, and B, you're aware of this so that if you start moving towards maybe, a higher percentage of this, like being motivated by all these external results and accolades, you can pull yourself back.
Beautiful. And actually, when we're talking about awareness, one of the things that I think of, and I love that you addressed early on in the book, is the biology of passion and the chemistry that's going on, because it's really important to understand that this dopamine rush we're getting, it's an addiction. And so we have to be aware of that, or we're just going and going and going, externally, that is.
Yeah, for sure. The definition of addiction, or at least the most widely clinical definition of addiction, is the relentless pursuit of something despite negative consequences. You could argue that a very good definition of passion is the relentless pursuit of something that society says is positive. But the relentless pursuit part and the craving is totally the same. And much like an addiction, especially with obsessive passion, it's not until you really, really rub your nose in it and realize what you're getting out of it, that's the awareness part, that you can start to change your behavior. So if you are someone that struggles with a substance abuse disorder, an addiction, when you get drunk or when you take that hit, that feels really good in the short term. But in the long term, that leads to suffering and negative consequences. Obsessive passion is very the same way. When you sit there refreshing your Twitter to see how many liked your tweets, or obsessing over how much money you have or how many people invested in your company, in the short term, that feels great. But in the long term, that tends to lead to a feeling of hollowness or emptiness. And then the cycle gets repeated, because how do you fill that emptiness? By seeking more external validation. And that's the cycle that we're trying to make sure that people don't get stuck in.
Beautiful. What would you say, and I'll go to Steve on this first, what's a fit mindset?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Passion and love actually have a lot in common as well. So the way I'll describe a fit mindset is talking about our pursuit of love first. So what happens with love is we tend to fall for this almost like Disney fairy tale story that tells us that there's one person for us, right? That there's a soulmate for us that we can find. Well, pure statistics probably throws that out the window, and we know that like there's probably multiple people that fit with us and we'll be okay. Well, the same thing happens in passion. Is a lot of people walk around with this mindset that there's one thing that they're passionate about, or that they need to find that thing that they're passionate about, right? With a common advice. Go find your passion. That is told at commencement speeches, graduations, all that good stuff. The advice to the college or high school student. Go find your passion and everything will be good. That's a fit mindset. What the research shows, though, is that it's more likely that you can develop and cultivate a passion from something that you're interested in. And again, the research shows something very interesting when you look at people who believe that there's something they should find or something they should cultivate. If they believe that passion is something that you find, then what happens when you start that activity and you instantly don't feel this like rush of relentless pursuit or drive for it, then you stop and you give up, right? You say, oh, this must not be it. I have to go look somewhere else. Those who believe that it can be cultivated, they'll spend more time to see, more time exploring their interests, more time doing the activity, just to see if, hey, is this something that can develop into it? And what you see is over the long haul, those people who believe that passion is something that can cultivate it, they have a higher sense of satisfaction or well-being for what they're pursuing, and their passion for those activities or interests increases throughout. right? And people who have a fit mindset, at the beginning, their passion for it is the highest, and then over time it decreases because they don't believe it can be developed.
And I know you're playing off of this, the term of Carolyn DeWick, of a fixed mindset, and that's being told. And she said the worst thing you can do with a child is tell them they have a talent in this area, because all of a sudden that becomes rigid. And if that box breaks and they all of a sudden don't do well in a test, they don't win the game, then all of a sudden there's no resiliency. But if you're open to pursue this, your interest, as you say, interest with an open mind, let's just play and see, then you're open, you're malleable, you're more resilient to whatever comes.
Exactly. And you know, as children, we're great at this, right? Because if you think about it, when when you're 6 years old, you might fall in love with being a firefighter. And then 8 years old, you want to be a writer. And then 10, it's like a sports superstar. Like, we go through and explore these different things that pique our interest. But as we reach adulthood, we kind of get beaten down with this idea of, okay, you've got to pick one thing that you're going to be really good at, and you're going to follow for the next 60 years. And I think if we fall trapped to that, we're losing out on all these potential interests that could turn into passions.
And I think that another thing worth just reiterating a little bit, well said, brother Steve, is that the connection between love, and especially in our generation, so we're both like the very upper end of millennials, we grew up hearing two predominant themes: find your passion, and there's a soulmate out there. And both of those sound great, but the flip side of both of those is burnout in people that are disgruntled dating. Because in the dating world, especially with online apps, it's like, well, there's 6 billion people and I'm supposed to have a soulmate. So if that first date isn't absolutely perfect, then, got to move on to the next person because I have endless choice. In the job market, the same thing. Everyone wants to have this perfect job right from the get-go. And that seeking mindset is a way to make sure that it will never be perfect. And as Steve said, like, you look in relationships and the same thing holds true. People that go into relationships not expecting a soulmate, but with the mindset that if this person is good enough and someone I can build something with, maybe it'll be perfect 20 years from now, those people end up in long relationships. And the same thing is true in the workforce. So I don't think it's a coincidence that our generation is suffering from a lot of burnout, and that The Atlantic is writing cover stories about the kind of lost love generation. People aren't getting married. They're not having kids. I think that a lot of this is related to this mindset of having an expectation that is unattainable and then falling short and then seeking.
Thank you. And there's a sense of helplessness in here, too, which is you're seeking, but there's only this one. Is this the one? Well, I guess not. I got to keep finding this next one, and as if there's some magic power that says you've got to find this one perfect being, or being or purpose, or passion for that matter, or everything in your life is not right. It gets to a philosophy that you address a little bit later in the book, which I've seen so many people who, they seem to be doing well in their path, and then they leap off the ledge. Go big or go home.
Yeah, you often end up home if you do that, unfortunately. So this is really interesting research, and I'll start with the science, and then I'll give a quick story. So the science looks at particularly entrepreneurs, and what they find is that entrepreneurs who have a great idea and then do just that, go big or go home, they're more likely to end up home. Their ideas don't work out. Entrepreneurs who have a great idea and they don't quit their day job, but they start pursuing it as a side hustle, those entrepreneurs end up with much longer term success, and those are the ones that eventually have their passion become a full-time gig. That's the science. I know this really well personally. Coming out of graduate school, I was a full-time coach and consultant. I didn't know writing. And when I started writing and having published work, there was a huge temptation to say, I've arrived, I'm a writer, I'm going to quit my job and just start writing. But I didn't. Because I realized I had just enough insight then, I didn't know the science, that if I would have done that, I would have had so much pressure to churn out stories that I might never have had the opportunity to explore a book, because I would have been paying rent writing clickbait articles nonstop. So by keeping my day job, it allowed me to very gradually ramp up the writing thing. And the paradox here is you can actually take much more risks when you keep your day job, because you don't have the pressure of needing to pay rent right away. So yeah, the side hustle, it's a real thing, and then you just gradually ramp up over time.
And I would say from my experience in starting the show, we're well over 1,000 shows in. The thing has just taken off. When I started, I stopped my coaching for a while because I said I have to focus all in on this. And then when my mother-in-law, who's over 70, is going, do I need get a second job so that you guys can still have food on the table? I'm going, oh my God. Back to my coaching I went. And this is probably what you found. Doing that, you got better at both. In fact, this beautiful book came out of your coaching.
Yeah, totally. Like, you have skin in the game, and you're actually not just sitting in like this ivory tower world of ideas, but you're seeing how they play out, and you have the freedom to mess up. Like, you can take risks. If you're starting this podcast and you need to hit a home run in every single episode to get sponsorship dollars to pay rent and put food on the table, you probably won't take too many risks. That's a pretty narrow, constricting situation to be in. If some of your basic needs are met because you've kept your day job, well, then you can go out there and take the long shot risks. And it's the long shot risks that often, when they're taken in this controlled way, end up with 1,000 episodes later, a great podcast.
Thank you. So Steve, you work with a lot of athletes who do want to do this go big or go home. What do you tell them?
Yeah, it's romanticized a bit, right? It's this like, oh, if I go all in, if I put all my cards on the table, like I'm going to see how good I can be. But what I tell them is often what you're doing is shooting yourself in the foot, right? Because you're increasing those expectations. You're increasing that internal and external pressure. You're doing all these things that are potentially harming your performance. Well, if you maintain some sort of semblance of not doing this go all in type thing, then that allows you to take some risks, to explore where you can be, to actually see how good you can be. And I think what it also forces you to do is focus on what matters. So a lot of times what happens when you go all in, you start thinking like, oh, I need to do this, and this. And by the end, you're doing 1,000 different things for your job. Well, only maybe 1, 2, and 3 actually matter. So, for instance, with Brad and I's writing, coaching, all this stuff, what it forces us to do is say, okay, what actually matters during this writing process, right? What do we need to get done? Like, what are the important buckets we need to check off or fill up? Same thing when we were launching this book. This book went a lot better than the first book, both in terms of performance, but also in terms of our own personal health, because like we did it wrong the first time.
I'll put the first time. I'm going to put wrong in quotes for you there.
Yeah,
it was a learning.
It was a learning. There you go. Yeah. That's it. It's not that the first book's great, but like when we launched it, we tried to do this like, oh, we're going to do everything. We're going to talk to 1 billion people and be online, social media, and tweet it out to the world and send it everywhere and travel the world. And by the end, we just got exhausted and we were like whoa, what hit us, right? And this go around, we were like, okay, in this instance, like, what are we trying to do? Well, we're trying to get the word out there, spread the word, sell books. So what actually does that, right? What actually are the big tickets that we need to check off there? And then also, like, what do we enjoy doing? And part of it is we enjoy having conversations like this with someone like yourself who brings a different expertise to the floor, because they're great, engaging conversations. And we're going to walk away from this feeling fired up and energized versus, traveling around to different random cities like last time, feeling completely drained when we were done.
It's self-awareness that gets you there. And like, we don't always practice what we preach, but I think this time around we did, because that first book, I've got a close friend that's an author, and he told me that be careful, because launching a book is like a sprint, and you get to the end of the sprint, and then you're on the start line of a marathon.
Yes.
And intellectually, I knew it, but it wasn't until we had run that sprint full out that I had the wisdom. Like, I knew it in my bones. And that's what helped adjust the next time around to say, hey, maybe we should just like disregard the sprint and start the marathon and pace ourselves a little bit better, let the race come to us. And as Steve said, the performance is basically the same, and our well-being is a lot better.
So let's go from there. In fact, let's talk about the mastery mindset. I believe it's 6 key points here, and maybe I'll bounce back and forth is a good way to do it. We'll see how this organically evolves. But I love this mastery mindset. This reminds me of, I watched a documentary on mastery years ago with, I think, Carlos Santana on it, and he was talking about the benefit of being stuck, in quotes, on a plateau rather than forcing your way through. So let's go. Mastery mindset 1, drive from within. And maybe we'll start with Steve on this one.
Yeah, so drive within is basically having more internal drive than external drive. So being motivated for doing the activity itself because of the love of the activity versus the rewards, likes, trophies, all those other things. And what the research and experience shows is that if you drift too far to that external drive and being motivated for those accolades, then that increases your likelihood of burnout. It increases your likelihood of lowering your well-being and satisfaction for it. And increases your likelihood of quitting that activity over time. So it's really important to cultivate this inner drive, that you're motivated because you enjoy the activity itself.
Is there something, and I want to go to the next 5 here, but is there something you can tell us about motivational patterns and kids and how to cultivate that inner drive?
Yeah, so there's a lot of good work out there. Carol Dweck, who you mentioned earlier, did some good work on this as well. And I think what you want to do, and I'm not a parent, Brad's a parent, a young parent, so maybe you could speak to this better, but having coached high school athletes and younger athletes, what you see is that if you're constantly holding out the carrot, right, constantly rewarding them to force them to do stuff, then they start paying attention to that reward and they start doing it for that reward. Or on the other hand, if they're being motivated to do an activity, or whether it's play sports or go to band practice because you're threatening punishment, well, again, what are you doing? You're reinforcing the idea isn't to do this activity because it's enjoyable or beneficial, it's to do it because I don't want to get punished. So it's being very cognizant and aware of what signal you're sending as a parent or a coach or as a mentor for what these young kids are doing.
Thank you. And then let's go to the next one. Let's go to Brad, and we've got focusing on the process.
Yeah, so focusing on the process, in particular, focusing on the process over results. Yeah, so goals are good. They're good if they act like North Stars. It's kind of like the destination. What happens is a lot of times people become obsessed on the goal, and they tie their self-worth to whether or not they accomplish that goal. And the path is actually like where life takes place. And by focusing on the path, you have the best chance of accomplishing the goal. So focusing on the process is just that. It's kind of getting the goal in your mind, outlining a way that you think you're going to get to it, but then not waking up every day and thinking of, am I closer to my goal? Waking up every day and being present for the process and saying, like, what's in front of me? What do I need to put my all into today? And if you knock out the process, again, the goal takes care of itself. And along the way, you don't have this kind of anxiety of, will I do it or not? Because you're just doing the process.
I like it. And so we'll go to 3 with Steve. We'll go to don't worry about being the best. I worry about maybe it's getting better. And so I was interviewing a running coach last night for uphill running. And I'm like, I don't care if I'm first or last. I'm like, okay, I probably don't want to enter it if I'm going to be last. But I don't really. What I care about is, what can I do to tweak this? What can I do to improve? What can I do to learn? And I have fun evolving through that process.
Yeah, you've got the right mindset. I mean, that sums it up, right? You have this mindset of growth, of where you're trying to evolve as a person. And what happens sometimes, especially when you're a pusher, is you see these results and you see, okay, what do I have to do to be the best or the best? And you start comparing yourself against others, right? But you can't control what anybody else in that race is doing. You can't control what any other author or entrepreneur is doing, right? That's out of your control. So why worry about it? So it's really shifting that judgment from not judging yourself against your peers, but judging yourself against yourself, right?
Yeah.
How am I trying to get better?
And I'm going to add to that something that you talked about earlier with judgment and non-judgment, being as kind and loving and gentle and non-self-critical, because we could use everything beautiful in this book and then flip it on its head to turn it against ourselves, couldn't we?
100%. That's a great point. You know, our inner narrative is often our most cruel enemy, right? I know this from, and I'm sure you do too, as well, as when you run, like that inner voice in your head sometimes is really mean, right? It's telling you to stop or slow down or find a hole to step in so you can get off of this run. And I think
then if you do that, then it's going to come back and say, what did you wimp out for? What were you you can't win.
Exactly. You can't. And that's why I think it's like this compassion, this self-compassion is incredibly important, because if we can't be kind to ourselves, then who can? So it's about, cultivating this idea and this awareness that, like, hey, you got to be kind to yourself.
That voice in your head that Steve talks about, that judgmental voice, it's like a crying baby. And when a baby's screaming, if you throw the baby out the window, that's not going to end well for you. Your life's over. You're going to be put in jail. If you yell at the baby or you try to reason with the baby, it's just going to cry louder. So sometimes what you do is you just need to pick up the baby and hold it and show it love, and then the baby calms down on its own. That's the practice for that judgmental voice.
And since we're talking about embracing, let's go right back to you with embracing acute failure for chronic gains.
So it's just that. It's thinking about there's this saying that I don't think I came up with it, so I can't give myself credit, but I don't know who did. It's a great saying. The goal is the path, and the path is the goal. Mm-hmm. It's as simple as that. And if you're on the path, then any point in time failure is not actually a failure. It's just a source of information. How can I do stuff differently next time? Doesn't mean that you can't be sad. Doesn't mean that, like, if you have a midterm goal and you don't hit it, like, you should be like, oh, everything's fine because I'm on the path. Like, no, get frustrated, get sad, let yourself grieve for a bit, but then realize that, hey, like, I'm not dead, so I'm still walking the path. So what can I take from this to help me in the future?
Beautiful. And Steve, let's go from there to patience and what's an obsessive?
Yeah, I think in today's modern world, we don't have enough patience, right? We're looking for the quick fix, the hack, that thing to get us our performance or our happiness. And what we've really found through research and writing and exploring these is that the path to mastery is a very long path. And you have to understand that, right? You can't rush down it and say, oh, I read this book, I listened to these guys, I'm going to be better, like tomorrow I'm going to do this. No, it's being in it for the long term, right? And I think a lot of times societally is we think these short-term acute gains, and it's really stepping back and having this long-term view. And I think, the obsessives among us, or what we've been calling in this conversation pushers, like our instinct is to always look at that next thing. And sometimes stepping back and seeing the big picture allows us to make larger gains over a longer time.
Beautiful. And then let's go to Brad for this next one. It seems somehow appropriate. What's the importance of watching paint dry?
Watching paint dry. We think that we pay attention to what interests us. It's actually the opposite that's true. What we pay attention to starts to interest us. So if you have your core values and you have a direction that you want to go in, got to pay attention along the way. So if you really want to, find paint fascinating, if you stare at a wall of paint, eventually it will be interesting. That's an extreme example, but I think that when you're on this path of mastery, there are so many bright and shiny objects on the side of the road. Mm-hmm. Pay attention to me, pay attention to me, pay attention to me. And if the more time you spend paying attention to those things, the more you're going to get pulled off the path. So it's about defining, like, what's important to me, where am I headed, and then how can I be present for those things? A coach that I work with, he always says that he could put together slides and he could write books, and all he really needs to say to people is pay attention. Like, that's it. It's as simple and as hard as that. Like, if you want to change your behavior, pay attention to what you do and the consequences, and everything falls into place. And if you want to go down this path, define the things, the process that you think is going to get you there, and then just pay close attention. But again, it's simple, but simple isn't easy, especially today when it's bling, 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 like Steve said, bright, shiny objects everywhere.
And I think it's, the biggest lesson I took away from this whole writing process was this, is not only pay attention, but like, what are you giving your attention to? And a lot of times that process is something that we're not aware of, right? Anytime our phone beeps, buzzes, makes a noise, like our attention goes whoop, straight to it. And we're handing over like this, you're now the most important thing in the world, like phone. And if we do that over and over again, like our brain is smarter than our conscious self. Like our brain's going to be like, you know what, every time that buzzes, like that, we need to pay attention to that thing because like it's important. So it's really made me step back and think of like, okay, at almost every moment is pay attention to like, what am I giving my attention to? If I'm on this conversation with you all, then my attention needs to be on this conversation with you because it's important. I think, even more so nowadays, again, I work with a lot of 18 to 22-year-olds, is they need to cultivate this ability more than anybody because you watch them have conversations sometimes, and I love the kids I work with, but they're not paying attention to the conversation, right? Because they're used to being distracted by this, and this. And you can tell if you're just standing there, the conversation isn't as good as it could be because they're smart, intelligent, curious people, but they're not allowing that to come to the forefront because their attention is split and directed in different ways.
So let's talk about, and either one of you, thank you so much, Steve, either one can address this one. I wanted to talk about the illusion of balance, but since you're talking about conversational skills, you share a story in here about Warren Buffett, and I think it's his wife who had passed on, who said, even when you were there having a conversation with him, he wasn't necessarily really there.
Yeah, so, the book is called The Passion Paradox because everything about passion's a paradox. Here, the paradox that we explore is, we already talked about the whole find and follow your passion. That's what my generation, probably your generation too, grew up hearing. The other thing that we hear all the time is have a balanced life and be balanced. Well, passion and balance are completely antithetical. If you're passionate about something, you get those blinders and you want to go towards that thing. And balance implies, at least in the conventional way it's discussed, implies that you don't do that, that you have equal proportion of time for equal things. And again, I think it's really important to be values neutral here. Neither is better. Some people are wired where they can have perfect balance, and that feels great, and they're content. And often I envy those people. Other people can't do that, and they feel like they're forcing themselves. It's like, oh, I really want to pursue this idea, but I'm supposed to be balanced, so I'm going to force myself to do all this other stuff. And then they just end up restless and angry and upset. So balance is an illusion if you're a passionate person, or even if you're just hooked on a passion. This doesn't have to be for your whole life. Like, try to tell someone falling in love to be balanced. All they can think about is the person that they love. So what we propose in the book is kind of a new paradigm, and that is, rather than try to be balanced, if you're in the throes of passion, go all in, give yourself permission to. Just make sure that you have enough self-awareness. This is so important, so you can keep perspective and constantly evaluate the trade-offs. Because it's one thing to go all in on writing a book or launching a podcast for 6 months or a year. If you communicate to the people that love you that that's what you're doing, it's another thing to do that for an entire life. And if you don't have self-awareness, the inertia of it just goes nuts, and that's when you can end up with regret. But again, it's very important to be values neutral, because even the people that do go all in for an entire life, like, that's not a good thing or a bad thing. It just is. Some of the best physicians, some of the best people in public health that have saved millions of lives and changed the world, they have had multiple divorces. Their kids don't love them. And we don't look at those people and say, that's a bad person. We're so grateful of it. They changed the world. So it's just about constantly being aware of where is your energy and how are you spending your time. As Steve says this so well, as long as you're the one making the choice about what to do, that's fine. The problem is when you're so swept up in the inertia of what you're doing that you lose the ability to make that choice. So I guess to simplify, as you can tell, we love to go deep on these topics. Rather than try to have this perfect balance, if you're feeling really passionate, just evaluate, like take some time to self-reflect. What's important to me? Let's say I want to go all on this. Give yourself 4 months and then come back, practice some meditation, whatever it is that gives you perspective, and then reevaluate. And as long as you progress like that, you're going to be okay.
Thank you. So, Steve, I've got to ask you on this one, on the same topic, because you have that subset of people who are probably glued to their smartphones at this point and have a hard time with self-reflection. When they're 100% committed to their passion, how do you help them to be able to snap back and gain any awareness on their lives?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it differs with every generation and experience. For Brad and I, that might be we gain perspective maybe through our meditation practice, right, or our mindfulness practice. But for someone 18 who's never experienced something like that, if you say, hey, go experience some mindfulness meditation, they'll look at you like, well, what are you talking about, right? So they have no idea or awareness of that. So what I try and do is come to their level and almost use analogies and create ideas that allow them to do similar things that we might do in different light. So, for example, for my college kids, like instead of a mindfulness practice, like we really push time away from your phone out in nature, right? Yeah. So going for walks, right? Spending time where you don't have to worry about a phone buzzing or beeping. No one's there. You're just going out for a walk in the park, right? Maybe after a stressful day of class or work or whatever have you. And that gives you time alone in your head. And then we spend a lot of time talking about, okay, what does time alone in your head look like? Where do these thoughts come from? Like, what do they mean? In runners, it's really easy, just like we talked about earlier, is you can kind of point to those voices that pop up in the middle of hard runs. That allows for an avenue to talk about some of these things that might give them the skill sets that are needed to cultivate some of this self-awareness that we might get through, as I said, a dedicated practice.
Thank you. Yeah. Brad, I want to kind of dovetail on that, and you can keep answering on that. But this seems like one that you'd have fun answering, and I can guide you along if you need us. When we're talking about self-awareness, what can you tell us about the Buddhist practice of 5 remembrances?
Yeah, so 5 remembrances. I love it. Hold on. At my desk, I've got so there's a Zen teacher named There's a Zen teacher named Thich Nhat Hanh, who I've never met in person, but has been a very, very influential person to me.
I just got to point out a synchronicity. The show that's live right now for today is one of his monks from Plum Village.
Oh, that's incredible. I'll have to check that show out. Yeah, so the universe unites like that. So the 5 remembrances is a Buddhist practice that is a short reflection that helps you maintain that perspective and that self-awareness to zoom out and say, is this how I really want to be spending my time? And I'll just read Thich Nhat Hanh's words. It's not exactly what's in the book, but it's pretty close. So the first of the 5 is, I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. The second is, I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. The third is, I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. The fourth is, all that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature to change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. So at this point, not every time, but most of the time I go through this, like, it can feel kind of sad and despairing even, because these are truths that we like to hide from. But then the 5th remembrance, and I think Thich Nhat Hanh puts this so beautifully, is, my actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. They are the ground upon which I stand. And to me, someone that has studied Buddhist psychology and Buddhist philosophy, that's what it's all about, because all that other stuff is impermanent, but your actions and the ripple effects, that's the stuff that's going to be in the universe forever. So when you realize that you have limited time with the people and things that you care about, and your actions are your only true belongings, well, then it becomes a little bit easier to decide if you want to spend your day scrolling through Facebook or writing a book.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I guess we'll start with Steve, and then we'll start to wind things down. A few quick wrap-up questions in a minute. Steve, what's the importance of writing our story?
So a lot of time what happens is we give over our story, our sense of self, to the outside world, to others. We let others kind of dictate it. We're become overly aware of maybe how our friends or family or peers judge us or see us. And what happens is we give that power over to them. But I think one of the most important lessons from this book is just that, is taking charge of your ability to write your own story. So to dictate who you are, right? What your identity is, and where you want to go. So I struggled with this a lot as an athlete who achieved success at a really young age, and then my identity almost cemented around that. And then that was great while I was doing well, but as soon as I didn't meet my own expectations, then I was burdened by this identity, and I felt like it was almost being forced upon myself, right? I had no power. It was almost this weight holding me down. So what I found is it's really important to take charge of that, right? To be in charge of your own story, to understand that, I myself, like, I can call myself a writer, runner, coach, whatever it is, but I'm in charge of how I see that. And I think that message is incredibly helpful for anybody listening, regardless of what they're doing. You're not what you do, right? You're who you are, which is up to you to write.
Thank you. And I feel like maybe tell me if I'm wrong here, the 401 and how it's cemented in you for better and for worse. I understand this as a runner. That cementing of a value forced you over time to reevaluate and look at all the different costumes and hats that we wear.
100%. It forced me to have these deep periods of reflection, because I had to figure out what my values are, what I wanted to stand for. And I think athletes are really put in an interesting position here, because a lot of times we do our defining best when we're in our 20s and maybe 30s, and then it's all, from a performance standpoint, all downhill from there. So we really have to step back and think about how we separate our sense of self from our performance metrics.
Well, it gets to a story that you share about a triathlete, Siri Lindley, I believe it was, who
Yep.
Moved to Boulder and was, well, go for it there, Brad.
So yeah, Siri moved to Boulder and was just totally all in on triathlon, and she became the fastest triathlete in the world. And she realized in the middle of her career that she was perhaps ready to move on from triathlon. And her coach at the time, a guy named Brett Sutton, thought that she was nuts and told her, this is a terrible mistake. You can win Olympic gold. And Siri felt that there was more to her identity than that. And she made at the time what was a wild decision, which was she retired at the peak of her career. And she was so good and so peaking that even 4 years later, for the next Olympic cycle, her coach begged her to come back. But by then, she was coaching athletes. She was doing equine therapy and raising horses, had adopted a bunch of dogs, had fallen in love. And she basically moved beyond that chapter of her life in a very graceful way. And I think that that's really courageous and hard to do. And Siri had the insight at that time to not just stay in this thing. And she's very open about this as well. So Siri's a lesbian, and she grew up, she's older at a time when that wasn't so accepted. And she felt that maybe a lot of her drive in triathlon was actually to try to have an identity that she could be proud of. And when she came to terms with her sexuality and when the society around her evolved in a more enlightened way to come to terms with that, she no longer needed triathlon to push it. I think it's a beautiful story. It's not only in the book. She has a book called Surfacing that tells this story in detail. So Siri is a really neat and good role model on someone that is passionate, achieved great things, but didn't let that become her identity.
Thank you. And I like how this kind of brings things full circle here, which is going back to right at the beginning. Do I have one passion, one person? There are different time periods of our life, sort of like the tides ebb and flow, the waves come and go. What may be your passion at one point may be something completely different at another, and to be okay to allow to love yourself and to give yourself the space to move on if you need to too.
Yeah, that's so, I mean, you get it, which is awesome. And the thing that I'll say, because I think it's important for listeners to hear, is that I hear that and I'm like, yes, but there's a little bit of anxiety because I don't have that figured out yet. Like, you're talking about impermanence and realizing that like things change and that's okay. And I think that it's real important to love yourself in the process, because there are times when what you say I feel deeply in my heart, and there are times when I can't imagine if I wasn't allowed to write what I would do. And it's okay to feel both those things, even on the same day. And it's just realizing that, hey, these are human emotions and it's okay. And in the long term, hopefully you're working towards enough self-love where it doesn't really matter where you're directing the energy, but like that's you. And however it manifests, again, it's the 5 remembrances, like whatever your actions are, like that's you. So act in accordance with your values.
Thank you. And Steve, anything you want to add to this? Because you are working with kids who you know a fractional number of them will actually, quote, make it to where they want to be. And sooner or later, everybody, you don't have to hang up the running shoes, but sooner or later, you're going to get to do something else as well.
Yeah, what I see is that that's a major problem. And I think sometimes adults and parents make it 10 times worse, right? Working with college athletes, it's amazing how many parents want their kids to have their life plan figured out at the age of 18, 19, 20. And what I try and get across is that these skill sets that you're developing, this work ethic, this drive, this ability to cultivate some perspective, like those are skill sets that you can apply to anything, right? It's not just running, or it's not just, physics or whatever your major is. Like these same skill sets apply to anything. And I think it's cultivating the ability to step away from things that maybe don't interest you anymore, passions that have run their path, right? And having the confidence to be able to do so. So with my young athletes, young college students that I work with a lot, it's about, getting them that awareness that it's like, once you get this degree, it doesn't mean that you have to do this job or be in this field for 60 years, right? Yeah. If you want to change fields, change completely in a couple years, go for it, right? But do it in this way, using these skills that you've now developed and you can now handle that.
In things run their path, I think if you try to force that, it can be really hard. So sometimes, again, like back to that, like pay attention. If you just pay attention to what your pursuit is getting you, eventually it kind of happens on its own. And I don't run at the level of Steve's athletes, but there was a period of time when I was in grad school that I was trying to go very fast in triathlon, trying to qualify for Kona. I was like a 950 and change Ironman. Yeah. And I was one of those type A triathletes that was all I could think about. And if you would have told me that I couldn't do triathlon then, I probably would have been depressed. But I just started paying more and more attention to like what was I getting out of my training. And what I found was actually like more anxiety than love. And by the time like I had zoned into that and felt that enough in my body, moving on was actually it wasn't very easy. It was pretty easy. It was kind of like I'm getting injured all the time. I'm putting all this pressure on myself. What would happen if I didn't do this? And now I can't imagine training for triathlon. And again, that's not to say that being a type A driven triathlete is good or bad. At the time, it was great. I learned a lot from it. But once you feel like you're kind of doing something like because you're forced to or you have to, just lean into that and pay attention to what you get out of that. And then the answer often just becomes clear itself.
It's a question I keep asking people lately. Does this feel light? Does it feel heavy? And
Yeah.
if getting up in the morning, day after day, is feeling heavy, there may be a shift coming in your future.
Totally. Or like constricting or open, expansive. I mean, these are all pointing at the same things. Yeah.
So on that note, I'll ask each of you separately, then we'll wind things down here. First off, what, for you, Brad, what personally brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call the woohoo factor?
I've got a 13-month-old. So it's, he doesn't always bring me the greatest happiness.
You do mention in the book, balance out the window when you have a newborn.
Yeah. So there are times when it's frustrating, but, more and more, when he does stuff that just melts your heart. So like he just learned how to blow kisses. And that's like heart melting enough. But yesterday I took him on a little walk carrying him in this carrier, and he has this new skill. And we live in Oakland. There's a lot of people. He was just blowing kisses to everyone. And stuff like that is it's hard. Awesome. It's really endearing. Yeah. So Theo.
So and Steve, for yourself, what brings you the greatest happiness, or what I call woohoo?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't have a kid, so I can't use that answer. I think probably what it is it's when I see, whether it's athletes I work with or people I work with who almost like achieve something that they didn't think was possible. Mm-hmm. And it's not the achievement that makes me go woohoo. It's like them breaking down barriers and seeing this growth that maybe 3-4 months ago they didn't think was there. And I think helping people along that journey, like there's nothing like it, that feeling at the end when both of you look and be like, wow, like that was awesome. And sometimes it's even if like the goal wasn't achieved, but it's like, wow, how in the world did we go through this process, right? Like look where we started and look where we ended up and all the things that we went through. And, being on that journey, whether it's on an athletic standpoint or even seeing someone who came in to college not prepared and stepping away with a degree and a passion for the future is something that it's hard to put a value on.
Awesome. On that note, for both of you, where can we go to find your book, find your beautiful book, and to find out more? And if you've got individual websites, let's make sure we mention both of them.
All right, so I will take this. And Steve, tell me if I'm forgetting anything. So the website for the book is passionparadoxbook.com. And if you just put Passion Paradox in our name in Google, you'll find the book. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it at bookstores. You can get it at airports. So please read the book. We put our all into it. And we hope it helps you. In terms of individual stuff, Steve's website is Science of Running. Mm-hmm. My website is my name, bradstulberg.com. I am on Twitter at bstulberg. Steve is on Twitter at Steve Magness. And then Steve is also on Instagram at the same name. I don't have enough hair for Instagram, so I leave that to Steve.
Fantastic. And if you didn't catch all the URLs and Twitter and all that good stuff, come on over to inspirenationshow.com. On that note, starting with you, Brad, any last words of wisdom you want to share with people?
I think that we've hit on this a bunch, and it's a theme in the book, and it's a theme that I just think like doesn't get hit on enough, and that is be kind to yourself. Especially people that are into this kind of book and God forbid want to write a book like this, a la me and Steve, you tend to like get into this world of personal growth, and it's really easy to judge yourself and be like, well, I'm not there yet. Something's wrong with me. And I think that any principle in a book like this, or really probably any principle in any book that's in this genre, is so much more impactful if you have some self-compassion to support it, and go in with a curious, non-judgmental attitude. And that's a skill to be cultivated if you were raised to be like an achiever. So just like really work on being kind to yourself, because that makes everything better.
Thank you. And Steve?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we didn't talk about a bunch, but I think is incredibly important, is the sense of community around yourself. Is who you surround yourself often becomes who you are. So it's incredibly important to surround yourself with people who have values that you appreciate. Part of the reason that Brad and I write books is because we've become best friends, right? And it's these conversations that we have to have, like this one right here, that are just fun, engaging, and fill up our energy buckets rather than take it away. So I would challenge people, especially in a time where we have these online social communities, to spend more time with friends, family, etc., in person, and without phones and technology, and like engage in conversations and get to know one another.
Thank you. And I can't believe I'm going to ask this, but I can't resist. Is there another book coming on?
We hope that there are many. There is nothing that is like currently in the pipeline. But Steve and I have ideas of books that we want to write together, of books that we want to write alone. Our goal and our path is to continue to work together, to think about these interesting ideas and put them out in the world. So hopefully, yes.
Woohoo! Well, thank you both so much for being here today. This has been a lot of fun. Really love your book. Can't recommend it enough. And I just want you guys to keep doing what you're doing and changing the world.
You too. Thank you for having us. Really enjoyed this conversation.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Steve. So for everyone out there, this is Michael Sandler saying, be well, have fun, get the passion paradox, and begin cultivating your awareness and success today, and shine bright. Woohoo! Thank you guys so much.
Yeah,
that
thanks.
was a lot of fun.
That was a blast. Thanks for asking such good questions.
Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like below. Also, leave your comments. Have some real fun with it. Subscribe to our channel where you're going to get more great videos, more interviews coming up. And check out our website, inspirenationshow.com. That's where you'll find tips, blogs, information, videos you won't find anywhere else, and useful and helpful resources to really help you kickstart your life and to shine bright. Thanks so much again. Thank you for your support. Like, comment, subscribe. See the website. Thanks so much and have fun. Of course, shine bright. Woohoo!